So Danny, if you're ready, you can go ahead and set up your presentation while I introduce you. So Danielle is a forest pathologist for the USDA Forest Service Forest Health Protection. She's stationed at the Morgantown Field Office. Danielle works with federal, state, and private land managers in the identification and management of invasive forest pathogens. So she's a great resource. She collaborates with universities in conducting forest pathology related research. She manages a plant disease diagnostic laboratory, uses molecular and laboratory techniques in the identification of injurious pathogens. She's got a bachelor's degree in forest resource management from the University of Minnesota and a master's degree in plant pathology from Oregon State University. She's certified as a firefighter and chainsaw faller and has detailed on multiple wildfire and hurricane disaster assignments throughout the United States. And she also details with USAID, AID, the lead federal international disaster relief agency. And we're really lucky to have her with us this morning. So take it away, Danielle.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Cool. So thanks. I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm going to give a quick talk on the pests and pathogens in relation to climate change. I have a short time slot, so I apologize in advance if I go a little bit quick. So I'm going to start with the disease triangle. You might already be familiar with it. It's a concept used to express the relationship between a susceptible host, the pest or pathogen, and also the environment. The simple model shows how all three aspects of the triangle need to be present in order for disease to occur. The environment part is generally focuses on climate and weather, but also includes factors such as soil, sand composition, and the microbial community. This factor is particularly applicable to discussions about climate change. And a recent paper re-examined the disease triangle, modifying this environmental factor to put greater emphasis on climate. So here is the climate pathogen model. Changes in precipitation, temperature regimes, and disturbance events affects the equilibrium of this triangle. And in doing so, forest disease can develop at an increased rate due to the direct effects of climate on pathogen biology. The tree itself may remain physiologically well suited to the climate and experience no relative stress under the novel conditions. However, the pathogen is given an advantage of a more suitable environment. An example of this would be needle blights and foliar diseases. Increased humidity and warm temperatures stimulates sporulation and colonization, creating a buildup of populations. Warm, wet summers over several years can increase disease incidence and severity, leading to decline in possible mortality. Another example of this is shorter, warmer winters, which affects insects. It can decrease mortality during the winter, and also they might be able to complete more life cycles. The climate stress model is a little bit different. It shows how climate can affect the stress of the tree itself, making it more vulnerable to opportunistic diseases and insects. Climates such as drought, flooding, excessive heat, and freezing can directly stress and kill a tree. These same stressors can also damage trees, predisposing them to infection by secondary agents. It's possible that climate conditions that stress a tree may also increase the virulence of some pathogens, making them more aggressive secondary agents. Example of this model would be higher rates of root diseases such as phytophthora or armillary root rots following flooding events, especially at lower elevations. Another example would be increased storm activity, creating more wounds, making trees more susceptible to decay organisms or to insects, such as those that vector wilts, such as Dutch elms or oak wilt, which we'll talk more about in a bit. The Climate Change Resource Center lists several pests expected to be impacted by climate change. Several of these listed here are relevant to West Virginia. I'm going to touch base on a couple of these, including Hemlock woolly adelgid, leech bark disease, and oak wilt. So we'll start with Hemlock woolly deltrite. HWA is a major insect pest causing widespread mortality of eastern hemlock. Hemlock woolly deltrite is likely to spread northward over the coming century as winter temperatures across the Northeast continue to warm due to climate change. A recent study found the estimated amount of overwintering mortality necessary to keep deltrite populations in check is likely to occur when the mean winter temperature is -5 degrees Celsius. By the end of the century, under the current high emission scenario, virtually all of the Northeast will experience average winter temperatures above -5 Celsius, which this suggests the entire Northeast could be susceptible to widespread HWA infection at that point. Under a lower emission scenario, isolated sections of upper New York and New Hampshire, as well as half of Maine, would remain within the -5 isotherm and would be protected from widespread infection. While the exact location of HWA infestations depends on other characteristics, in addition to temperature, these projections make it clear that continued spread of HWA across the Northeast is likely to occur over the coming century. However, at the same time, reducing emissions of greenhouse gases and hence the expected degree of warming over the coming century has the potential to greatly reduce the extent of forest likely to occur damage from HWA, particularly at higher elevations and at the northern part of the region. The good news is that there's some control options available. There's a couple different insecticides effective in controlling HWA. These treatments are recommended for HWA control on accessible, individual, high-value infested hemlocks. Right now, we're focusing on campgrounds and day-use areas within the national forest. Imidacloprid is the preferred insecticide. It is available in tablet and injectable form, and it protects the tree for 5 to 7 years. An alternative is dinotefron, which is only effective for 1 to 2 years and is only available as an injectable. The benefit is its faster mobility within a tree, and it protects against other pests, such as elongated hemlock scale. Of course, all insecticides come with their own dangers. Laboratory studies have shown that imidacloprid bioaccumulates within salamanders and cause sublethal effects. Laricovius beetles are used as a biocontrol, and when used as an integrated pest management strategy, could be useful in helping to control HWA. Recent studies suggest that thinnings and increased light can also reduce HWA densities. However, thinning stands is not thought to be useful in areas where HWA is already present. So I'm going to move on to oak wilt. We also expect to see a higher incidence of oak wilt. Oak wilt is a highly lethal fungal pathogen affecting mainly members of the red oak family. However, it can also affect white oaks. While oak wilt fungus frequently spreads via root grafts of the same species, overland spread of oak wilt is vectored by nidotuli beetles. These are tiny little beetles that are attracted to the fruity smell produced on spore mats underneath the bark of an infected tree. Here comes the beetle. They're then attracted to the volatiles produced by healthy trees when there is a wounding event, either caused by storm damage, pruning, or harvesting. Climate change and global warming is expected to cause an increase in the transmission of oak wilt due to increased overland spread of these insect vectors. What can you do? One critical thing that can be done is to reduce spread of oak wilt is to limit pruning and harvesting to winter months to reduce wound formation. Since oak wilt travels to root grafts of the same species, it is also important to increase species diversity. Luckily in West Virginia, we have more mixed species stands, so it's not as big of a problem as it is in the Midwest, where they have a stand of just red oak. Harvesting or removing infected trees is important to reduce spread. We have more information on controlling oak wilt. I have a whole half-hour presentation on just oak wilt, so please don't hesitate to ask for additional resources. Another important species that is expected to be affected by climate change is American beech. Overall beach health is expected to be directly impacted by climate change, as beaches are particularly sensitive to both drought and flooding. The increase in global temperatures will likely shift the current range of American beach. It is expected the range of beach will move both northward and to higher elevations, with predicted increases in global temperature. Not only will American beach range be affected by climate change, but the warming temperatures will favor the pest and pathogen as well. Beach bark disease is a disease complex involving a non-native scale insect and neonutria fungi. Warmer winters are expected to favor propagation and survival of both the beach scale and the fungus, increasing overall incidence. There's some mitigation strategies that can be considered to help ensure the survival of American beach. Resistance to the scale has been shown to be a genetically inheritable trait in American beach. It's estimated between 1 and 5% of beach are resistant to the scale insect. Breeding programs have focused on the propagation of disease-resistant beach, which can be used in planting efforts. Research has provided evidence that silvicultural treatments where diseased beach are removed and sprouts are treated with herbicides can also improve stand quality while maintaining a healthy beach component. Removing diseased beach from a stand also allows for the regeneration of other desirable species. Well, while the effects of climate change on our forests seems daunting, there's some things that we can do now. This includes early detection and action, using models to forecast spread, and planning and mitigation. By promoting healthy and vigorous trees with a diverse species and age class, we can increase resilience within our forests. Appropriate silviculture actions can help reduce pathogen incidence and increase vigor. We can also utilize breeding programs to select resistant species. So I know that was really fast. I only had 10 minutes, but I have a lot more information on all of these pests, so please don't hesitate to reach out to me for more information. We might also have a couple minutes for questions.
Yeah, so if folks have any questions for Danielle, feel free to unmute and ask them. You're also welcome to put them in the chat and we can read them off. I'm really glad that that presentation is recorded because it's super comprehensive, and I'm in Michigan. I think I'm going to have to get your oak wilt graphic. I really liked that with the beetle, and I'd love to get the presentation as well.
Yeah, I have a ton more information on oak wilt management. It's a manageable disease with removal of trees and trenching. But it's a little complicated and it's a little cost prohibitive, but I can provide any of that information for you.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Danny. And yeah, if anybody else has questions they want to put in the chat, Danny can respond to them directly. So now I'm going to tee us up for Greg. And so Greg, if you want to go ahead and get your presentation prepped, you should have co-hosting privileges. And I'll go ahead and introduce you. So Greg Nowacki was born and raised in Wisconsin's Northwoods and attended the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, where he received bachelor's and master's degrees in forestry and natural resources in the mid-1980s. Afterward, he went eastward, successfully getting his PhD in forestry at Penn State University. And his graduate studies were keenly focused on oak ecology, relating changes in oak abundance to land use and fire. Immediately after college, Greg served as an old growth forest ecologist with the Nature Conservancy for 2 years prior to signing on with the U.S. Forest Service in Alaska. Greg transferred to Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 2001, where he presently serves as the regional ecologist and soils program manager for the Eastern region. Throughout his career, Greg has dedicated his work to facilitating the transfer of science to land management.
All right, do you hear me first and foremost?
Yeah, crystal clear.
All right, number 2, share screen. I'm putting that up. I have one participant can share at a time, multiple participants can share simultaneously. The latter is checked right now. I'm trying to get my screen up.
Oh, that looks like, yeah, great. We can see your PowerPoint screen now.
All righty, thank you so much. Here we go. Okay, everything good? I'm not going to share the video, spare you guys of my face here this morning. So, presentation as introduced, oak fire and climate change, the profound effect of changing conditions on the oak resource. Thank you for the introduction. Got a lot of information here, so everybody open up their gray matter. It's going to be a fire hose of information coming your way. Main objectives of today's presentation. We're going to establish the historic relationship oak and fire. We're going to document the profound effect of land use change in fire suppression policies that we currently endure. And lastly, we'll project possible effects of future climate change on the oak resource. I want to thank Patricia for your lead-in presentation. It was great, and it's going to fortify this presentation today. So exactly, what is the problem here? It's basically the lack of oak regeneration and the overall demise of oak ecosystems. And this is ubiquitous across the eastern United States. So it's probably best to start at the beginning. One is that let's look at pre-settlement conditions. When we think about oak-dominated ecosystems or oak pine systems, historically, they were not necessarily forests, closed canopy forests, but they're more woodland-ish, right? Scattering of trees, sunlight penetrating down to the forest floor, and less density than what we see today. Moreover, lacking often. So in order to quantify conditions of the past, we can turn to studies that have documented density, diameter, and basal areas based on witness trees. The witness tree databases, unfortunately for you, but it comes out of the Midwest. So you can see a series of studies here from Illinois, Wisconsin, and other states. The things that I want to point is that historic densities of our pre-settlement oak-dominated stands tended to be low. The diameters themselves were high, and I see my internet connection is unstable. Whoops, that's frightening. Combined together, these two parameters afford for a lower basal area than expected. In the diameter distribution, basically was quasi-even, small, medium, and large stems occurring. Again, here, since we were dealing with woodland conditions, there were highlight conditions affiliated with that, right? So you had sunlight penetrating down through the overstory into the understory. That made for a very robust, a very diverse understory made up of grasses, forbs, which will appear momentarily. There you go. A lot of information on these screens. And lastly, a grand shrub component, blueberry, raspberries, huckleberries, all those good things. So this is how conditions were quite often in the pre-settlement forest. Woodland conditions, lower stand densities, robust understories made up of these life forms. One thing I want to emphasize is greater than 80% of total plant richness comes from the ground flora layer. This is where it's at. What happened along the way? Well, we had Europeans that came on the scene, and we had the great cutover that took place. We had larger trees that were cut down, boughs extracted for timber resources, of course. And we had some regeneration that were left on site, smaller pine trees and oak trees that you see here. Well, it wasn't just a great cutover that took place. most landscapes, they were followed by the burnovers, right? So we had a lot of slash on the ground, new ignition sources, and these systems indeed burned. But they affected the regeneration layer differently. The larger oak individuals, some of them were spared just because they were large enough, they were armored, they were able to tolerate that fire. The pine regeneration absolutely got hammered just because by and large, they don't have the ability to sprout. There's some exceptions to that. Pitch pine is one of those, but for most of our pine species, they were directly, their death took place immediately after those burns. And the individuals that were top killed that happened to be oaks and hickories and chestnuts at the time, they resprouted along with the larger stumps that were left on site. So for forest recovery, oaks benefited tremendously from the great cutover and the great burnovers. Whereas pine, well, if you had some seed trees that were left behind, they were able to regenerate by seed if there was a long enough hiatus between fires that took place, because many of the burnovers were repetitive, of course. So these systems grew over time into today's conditions, but today's conditions are very different than what they were in the past. We know that the composition has changed tremendously, shifted largely towards oak, less towards pine, based on what I just explained. Another thing is just the structure itself. These are the same studies I had on before. Within a larger column, you have two columns. The first information is pre-settlement. The second column represents current conditions based on FIA. Density-wise, we have a tremendous increase that has taken place over time. Diameters, the average diameter decrease. That's not surprising when you're dealing with secondary and tertiary forests that we now occur in the landscape. Now, combined together, basal areas have actually increased. We think, of course, it's mainly because of this huge increase in stand density. And there's been a dramatic change in diameter distributions going from this quasi-even to a strong inverse J-shaped curve dominated by small stems today. So in summary, what has happened over time, pre-settlement to present day, we see this large increase in tree density anywhere from 2 to 10x. We have a decrease in average tree diameter, again, not surprising, anywhere from 10 to 20 centimeters less. Coupled together, there has been an increase in basal area. And lastly, this dramatic shift away from this kind of quasi-even distribution of small, medium stems to one that's inverse J-shaped, loaded with small and medium-sized diameters of today. So tremendous shifts, both compositionally and structurally. Now, under today's low light conditions, what has happened? Well, the first life form to wink out are your grasses, just because they're very much dependent on high light conditions for survival. Next are our forbs. They have a little bit more energy in their root systems, able to eke it out a few years, but eventually they succumb. And lastly are the big guys in the understory, at least, regarding these life forms, that is the shrubs, last to go. And what are you left with? Well, a leaf layer, basically. I've been from southern Minnesota across through Wisconsin, Indiana, Ohio, to southern New England, south to Carolinas, westward again through Kentucky, Tennessee, Ozarks, Ouachitas, back up to the Wisconsin area. Same scenario. We have a close canopy overstory of oak, and the understory is largely leaves. That's all I do is kick leaves, I swear. And the few species oftentimes that I see occurring are exotics, right? Multiflora rose, honeysuckle, buckthorn, oh my goodness. So kind of depressing to see this condition, and also makes one, and at least scratch your head, you know, from an evolutionary standpoint, how does this happen? You know, why would you have what's healthy oak ecosystem, right? Down story with no ground flora. Something is awry. So anyway, going on, under today's low light conditions, our shade intolerant oaks and pines have basically ceased regenerating, whereas shade tolerant competitors such as maples, beech, basswood, they regenerate not only prolifically, but they successfully recruit these closed canopy conditions. And over time, They go from seedling to sapling, sapling to mid-story. And this, my friends, is the basis of mesification. This shift from xerophytic species, oak, pines, hickories, to these mesophytes, moisture-loving trees. So what's driving mesification? Note the large oak in the middle, surrounded by maples and other mesophytes. Oh, there's all sorts of things that have been thrown out there. Climate change, increasing precipitation or moisture, changes in carbon dioxide. These are the things that were spoke to earlier, of course. Nitrogen fertilization, that's all connected with climate change, directly or indirectly. Oak overbrowsing by our favorite little deer. Fire suppression, of course, in there. Even our poor little pasture pigeon has been implicated in this process. But when you look at the totality of all these factors, really there's one that rises to explain what is going on regarding the demise of oak ecosystems, and that's fire suppression. If we look at the area burned in the eastern United States, this is spanning from 1935 to roughly 1990. The area burned is on the side axis. We see back in the 1930s, roughly about 10 million hectares were burning annually. We see a substantial decrease in the 1940s into the 1950s, and basically baselining from 1960 outward. And why this dramatic decrease in fire? Well, we postulate that it's mainly due to post-World War II deployment of men and materiel to fight these fires. And they're very, you can see that it's bared out in the numbers here. So there's a reciprocal relationship between the importance of fire and mesification, right? So in pre-settlement times, back in the 1800s, before 1900, again, we had these open ecosystems of pine, oak, highlight conditions, a very diverse and rich understory of shrubs, grasses, forbs. Something happened along the way to paradise here in the mid-1900s. We have fire suppression that kicked bear policy, went strong. We all at once went from these open ecosystems to a closed canopy, and with that you had increased shade. And now you start seeing these little guys popping up in the understory. What are those? Those are your mesophytes. Now, going into today, we have this dramatic increase of shade-tolerant species that are occurring. So you have seedlings, and they're recruiting to sapling stage. And my computer is telling me my internet connection is unstable again. Wow, on a roll here today. Okay, now into the foreseeable future. We have basically decreased flammability due to mesophytic litter. We'll get into that shortly. And of course, because now we have these multiple canopies that have set up overstory and a dense understory or midstory of these mesophytes, we have these cool, humid microclimates that have set up. So getting fire back in these ecosystems when they're in